Thank you. Voila. Technical difficulties. A usual problem. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I'm very happy to be in San Diego to give a talk. Strangely enough, it's the very first time that I'm giving a talk in San Diego. And I've been many times in America teaching and giving talks. And San Diego is a little bit of a hometown for me. I've got several, but this one is too. My son was born here. My daughter and son-in-law and 2 grandchildren live here. Actually 3 now. He just got married. So it's a bit of home. And yet I've never talked here at all. So it's very nice for me to do that. And I'm happy to see you here tonight. And Carl, thank you very much for your nice words. And look forward to seeing you at the course at Green Gulch. I saw your name on the list. So the title I choose for the talk, A Stairway to Heaven. Believe me, I didn't know it was a song. I had no idea. Probably way after my time when I was interested in songs. But what it actually meant to me, and I like to convey that meaning to you, is that the Buddhist teaching is a graduated teaching, and that's what it's usually called, a graduated teaching. But I didn't think that was a very appealing title. So I thought, well, Stairway to Heaven sounds much better. And stairways, you need to make steps, one step after another, until you get to the top of the steps. And that's exactly what the teaching is all about. Also, if you can think of a ladder that you'd like to climb up on, and it's a very high ladder, and if you keep your eyes on the top rung, you're bound to stumble. You've got to keep your eyes on the next rung that you're going to put your feet on. So this is exactly the same with the teaching. It's no use trying to look for perfection, or even imagine perfection, or pretend perfection, which is also not so uncommon. The only thing to do is to try and get from the first rung of the ladder to the next one, and then to the next one, and the next one. There are many ways one can explain this stairway to heaven. I'm choosing one particular way. The Buddha gave 17,500 discourses, which have all been translated into English and are available. And so the same topics are always present, but looked at from different angles. So we're going to look at it from one particular angle tonight. Namely, 4 different kinds to find heaven. If we are honest to ourselves, which I hope we are, we will undoubtedly come to the conclusion that all we really want in life is to be happy. What else? That's it. And it's a perfectly valid ambition. The only thing that's wrong with it is that people go about getting that happiness in the most peculiar ways. And once having found that their particular way didn't work finding another peculiar way of doing it. And one can spend one's whole life trying to find it, find happiness, and always going to something else, but never really feeling fulfilled. There's a sort of longing inside of one's heart. And if one listens to that, one knows it's there. But one may not be absolutely certain what one is longing for. One could call that longing a longing for fulfillment. Or one could call it a longing for perfection. One can call it a longing for peace. One can call it many things. But if one wants to actually be on a spiritual path, the first thing one has to know with that longing is that the only way to fulfill it is through one's inner being. And this is the peculiarity and the unfortunate search that people are engaged in. They're looking for fulfillment outside of themselves. And since the world we live in and everything that exists has so many different facets, we call that in Pali papancha, proliferation. There is so much to see, so much to hear, so much to read, so much to talk about, so many people to know, so many trips to take. There is no end to it. Then if one should open up one of these magazines, then it gets even worse, because there are another 500 or 1,000 different things being offered that one can do in order to be really happy. Starting from toothpaste, going through crystals to physical things. I mean, there's no end to it. You've all read them far more than I have. You know exactly what's being offered. And one lifetime is not long enough to try it all out. So all this, what I'm now mentioning at the moment, goes through our senses. Hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, and thinking. In Buddhist terminology, thinking is the sixth sense. We have the five senses, which we can see physically, and then the sixth sense, which is thinking. But all the things that we can get from the outside, which can make us happy, all have to go through the senses. And the Buddha calls that the first level of happiness. He's by no means denying the fact that we can get some happiness that way. But it's the lowest level. It's the grossest level. And not only that, it's entirely dependent. We're entirely dependent upon getting what pleases us. And I'm sure everybody here has tried over and over again to get only what pleases them. It's not possible. We get both. We get what pleases us, and we get what displeases us. That is human nature. It's totally out of the question that we can only get what pleases us. And if you think for a moment back on last week, or yesterday, or whenever you like to put your mind on, you will know that the day is fraught with both. We always get both. And what we're doing with that is another mistaken way of trying to be happy. As I said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the ambition to be happy. On the contrary, that was all the Buddha really taught. He taught how to be happy independently. But what we do with the things that displease us, whether it's what somebody said or some of our involvements or our obligations or the way our body feels or the way the weather is going or the way our partner is acting or the way the boss is doing what we want him to do, whatever it may be, we think it's due to that outer happening. And that way, we can never make it. As long as we think that it's due to the outer happening, we want to change the outer happening. And we do. There's no doubt we can change. We can change things around. But the same things happen again. Again, things happen that don't please us. All interchangeable with things that do please us. But nobody gets it 100%. If we're lucky, and lucky means having made good karma, we get 50-50. And that's pretty good. We should be very satisfied. If the day goes 50-50, 50% of the day is very pleasant, the other 50% isn't all that wonderful, that's great. But as long as it goes then, when it changes to 60-40, 60 unpleasant, 40 pleasant, then, of course, we're in trouble. Then we have to change something. But what we forget, and all of humanity forgets this, we are not having a monopoly on this sort of thing. All of humanity forgets that the only thing we can really change are our own heart and mind. That we can change. What we constantly try to do is hoping to change somebody else's heart and mind. It's so difficult to change our own, not to speak about changing somebody else's. But what really happens when we change our own heart and mind? When our reactions become different, when our whole feeling is one of flowing with the things as they are, not trying to resist them, not being dependent upon sense contacts for our happiness. And as some more peace comes into our heart, there's more peace in the world. And we forget that too. We all want peace, there's no doubt about it. Peace is a big word, a big thing. Everybody wants it. The United Nations has been trying at it for years on end, without any success, of course. What can we do about peace? We can learn to be peace. And each single person that has peace and happiness within is one more link in the chain of peace and happiness in the world. Our new physics, they're not that new anymore, but anyway, they're our new physics, which have substituted for the Newtonian age, tell us that there are no observers, there are only participants. And I think we believe these scientists. They're very convincing. They write long books about these things, more than half of which we don't understand. But it sounds very convincing. It sounds very good. And should we have studied it, of course, we do agree with them. But what does it mean for us in everyday life? That there are no observers, there are only participants. That we're all working together. If we have one person that's happy, one person that's peaceful, everyone around that person has some participation in that. So what's our biggest obligation? Our biggest obligation is not to ask others to be peaceful. Our biggest obligation is not to find happiness through our senses. Our obligation to ourselves and mankind, which we should never for one moment forget, is to have peace in our own heart and happiness in our own heart. And if we only rely upon our sense contacts, and unfortunately, most of mankind does. There are 6 billion of us, so there's a fair few, and most of mankind relies on sense contact for happiness. Should sound nice, should look nice, should taste nice, should be nice to the touch, and smell nice, and we'll think something nice. In fact, what we're thinking is very oft fantasizing, hoping, and planning, and hasn't got any bearing on reality. If it does, it can bring some happiness and peacefulness. It's the only sense that will do that. The others, if you can think for a moment, when you hear something, most beautiful music, the ear cannot say, that's Mozart, I love it. It's impossible. It's the mind that does it. The ear hears sound. And the eye can't say, this is a beautiful rose, and I enjoy it. The eye can only see color and shape. It's the mind that does it. The mind reacts to that color and shape. The mind reacts to the sound, and so with all the other senses. So what we do when we rely on our senses for happiness, we're relying on something which is very fleeting, very short-lived. Sense contact has to be short-lived, otherwise it becomes most unpleasant. Imagine having to eat something that tastes good for 2 hours. I mean, it's just really miserable, isn't it? So it's got to be short-lived. Some of them are very short-lived, some take a little longer. And we have to chase them up again and again. We have to get the same sense contact, which was so pleasant, over and over again. And the second and the third time, it might be all right. The fifth and the sixth time, it has to be a little stronger to make an impression. So we're chasing very momentary happiness and are expending our energy and our time and our money for pleasant sense contacts, which are all disappearing almost immediately. Obviously, our whole economy is based on that, but that's neither here nor there, because even if we find out that that's not the way to be happy, we're still going to have nice sense contacts. In fact, they're going to be much more pleasant. And that happens in meditation courses. People who have taken meditation courses might know that experience. Having not had many sense contacts during meditation course, they go outside and all of a sudden the grass looks greener and the sky looks bluer and the clouds look whiter and everything looks very clean. It's exactly the same scenery that was there before they started the course. But what happens is that when we're not searching for pleasant sense contact, neither searching nor trying to hang on to them, nor trying to get them back because they were pleasant, then we can be with them We can be right in that moment, and then they have a real impact. You may have, in the past, enjoyed a wonderful sunset. It may have been even a small peak experience. And then you might have thought, or sunrise, or waves in the ocean, you might have thought that your happiness comes from the sunset or the sunrise or whatever it may have been. And then you try to repeat that. And the next time, it's a sunset. It's all right, but it doesn't have that same impact. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the sunset or the sunrise or the ocean or whatever it was. It's having a moment of totally giving oneself to the experience. That's all it was. And it was triggered by the very impactful visual or audible contact, usually visual. That was a trigger, but that's all, just a trigger. And then forgetting about oneself and giving oneself to that moment. And it doesn't matter what the trigger is. But again, if that happens, we are dependent upon that outer trigger. And that outer trigger, of course, they're everywhere, these triggers. But very rarely are we able to give ourselves to them totally. It's very rare. It's when we completely forget about I'm sitting there or standing there looking, and there's only the visual impact. Then it's possible. Now that sort of thing, with our sense contacts, we learn immediately, or almost immediately, through the meditative path. Because meditation, in order to succeed, has to be without sense contacts. We don't need sense contacts. In fact, they're nothing but a disturbance in meditation. So as long as we are looking for the outer triggers in order to find peace and happiness, we'll never have complete fulfillment. There'll always be something, that feeling of there's lacking something inside. It's a sort of like a bit of an inner disquiet, which one likes to quieten down with many things. There's so much we can do to quieten it down. All we have to do is press buttons these days. There's so many buttons to be pressed. Some of them don't work so well, but most of them do. So that isn't the answer. That isn't the answer for peace and happiness. And going into the past and trying to figure out what went wrong, that isn't the answer either. Because the person who experienced the past and the person we're now, they have very little in common. That's all gone. The Buddha said, the one who made the karma and is experiencing the results, that is the same, is one wrong view. And that the person who made the karma and experiencing the results is totally different, is another wrong view. The answer is in the middle. There's memory and there is consciousness, but it's all down the drain, what happened. Being here now, a wonderful book title, years and years ago. It never got outdated because it means knowing exactly what's happening with us. So our sense contacts, although the Buddha does not deny that there is happiness in them, and we can't deny that either, is still the lowest level and the most unsatisfactory, because it's totally dependent. And being dependent is the opposite of being free. The Buddha taught freedom. Freedom from everything. So that would be our first step. Now the next level of happiness he talked about are called the Brahma Viharas, which means divine abidings. Vihara is a place to live, and the Brahmas are gods. So it doesn't mean that we have to change ourselves from being human to being gods, but it means that we can find a feeling of heavenly reaction within ourselves if we practice these emotions. Now, there are four emotions. And those of you who've read the Buddha's teachings or heard them, Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha, which is, first one, loving kindness. It is impersonal love. Second one, compassion. The third one, sympathetic joy. And the fourth one, equanimity. Now, according to the Buddha's teaching, these are the only four emotions worth having. All the others can be discarded. Now, just imagine one day in your life discarding everything else except impersonal love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And the last one, equanimity, is the highest of the emotions. It's the seventh factor of the seven factors of enlightenment. Equanimity, even-mindedness. It doesn't mean that there's no love and compassion in that. Even-mindedness can only exist with love and compassion. When there's no love and compassion in it, then it isn't even-mindedness. Then it is disinterest. So the practice, and everything depends on practice. The practice of loving kindness and compassion is something that we can learn. It's very interesting to know, I think anyway, that one can learn love. According to the movies, which have a great influence on people, and according to the novels, love is a lucky happening. If we're lucky, we meet somebody who loves us and who we can love back. Well, love is not a lucky happening. Love is a quality of the heart. It's a big difference. Because if we think it's a lucky happening, that there's a knight in shining armor or a princess in a beautiful gown that will happen to us, then we don't try very hard to develop this quality in us. We're waiting for this moment when this wonderful thing is supposed to happen. And it happens in the movies, it happens in the novels, so why shouldn't it happen in real life? Well, it can't, because it isn't real. The only thing that's real is a loving heart. And this is what the Buddha's teaching is about love. It's the second level, by the way, of happiness, and we've got four. Of course, it's far more subtle and refined than the first one, where we're talking about sense contact. And again, I'd like to make clear that that doesn't mean that we're not going to have pleasant sense contact. I'd just like to repeat that because it often gets misunderstood. But what it means is that we're working on our heart and our emotions to purify them. And purification is the secret of the spiritual path. That's all it is. If there's no purification, we haven't got a spiritual path. Then it's all wishful thinking. We're terribly good at that, at wishful thinking. And the only trouble with that is that when it doesn't work, we feel downcast and upset, and we think something must have gone wrong outside of ourselves. Wishful thinking is the opposite of practice. We've got to learn it. Love is learnable. We all have it in our hearts. There's no doubt about it. If we didn't have it, there would be no way we could cultivate it. But we're not using that particular quality in the right way. What we're doing is we make boundaries. We choose whom we care to love. We select 1, 2, 3, 6 people, 12. And in those 12, we also have gradations. First one, big love, then comes less and less. That's not love. That's judgment. And then another thing that happens with that, if we have, let's say we have 12 people whom we love, that's a lot. What happens? We are deathly afraid that, especially the first 1, 2, or 3, that we should lose one of them. And fear is equal to hate. It doesn't mean we hate those people. It means we hate the idea of loss. We're afraid of loss. Every mother of small children knows that, knows it so well that it has become part of her life, more strongly usually than in the father's case, although they have some of that too, but the mother has more. And most mothers don't even have to have small children to know it. They can do it with big children too. They're afraid that something may happen to them. And that's taken as totally normal. Why? Because everybody does it. Is it really absolutely normal what everybody does? If it were, why isn't everybody happy? That would be normal. If everybody was really happy, that would be normal. What we are afraid of in this loss is that one person or 2 or 3 where we feel this real warm and caring emotion, that if they get lost through accident, through death, through changing their mind, whatever happens, that if we lose them, then love is lost. Because we can only feel it because there is that person. That's a terrible dependency. And that is what the Buddha teaches. And mind you, it's a long, drawn-out practice where we can one day say, I love my neighbor's child the same way I love my own. Not easy. The own child doesn't get less love, not at all. All the neighbors' children are included. All the neighbors are included, not because they're so lovable. Are we so lovable? It's got nothing to do with being lovable. Nothing at all. It's because the only worthwhile emotion that a human heart should carry or can carry is love. All the other emotions are useless. They make life difficult for oneself, and by making life difficult for oneself, one makes life difficult for the people around us. We are not observers. We are participants. I'm sure you can relate to this. You've been in a room and somebody comes in and is furious. Doesn't say a word. It's just furious. You can feel it. You know it. And after a while, if you stick around long enough, you feel either furious or depressed from it. But another person comes in, and the person is joyous and loving. Doesn't say a word, but you can feel it. And after a while, you can feel with that person. It happens all the time. We have a great influence on everyone around us. So loving other people does not require those other people to be lovable, nor does it require that these other people love us back. That's the worst part of the whole thing, that we're willing to love if somebody's going to love us back. But we can't wait for that. Maybe they'll never do it. So how long are we going to wait? Or maybe they'll do it in 10 years. That's too long. Or next year. Now is the only time. We don't have any other time, only now. So we need to, and we can, on this second level of happiness, educate our hearts to be loving no matter what, instead of judgmental. We're very good at being judgmental. We all have some facility for psychology, so we know what's wrong with other people. Usually we know more what's wrong with them than what's wrong with us. But that's okay, so we know what's wrong with them. But that doesn't need to stop us from loving them. There's something wrong with everybody. Definitely. Because if it weren't, we'd all be enlightened. This lesson or this practice is something we can practice every day. Every single day of our lives we meet people. And here in America, it's a practice for people, or here in California, I don't know, to say, have a nice day. Or sometimes they say, how are you going? And then they say, how are you doing? And when you're not used to it, and I'm not used to that, because I don't live here anymore, it doesn't sound honest. It sounds just like a sentence. But one could make it sound honest. And one person today said to me, have a nice day, and I actually believed her. And I wished her a nice day too. I actually believed it. It sounded as if she meant it. Now this is the first practice we can do. We can say it as if we mean it. And after a while we're going to mean it. We can think about it. Now that person that I'm just talking to, they're going to be, this is early morning now, let's say it's 10 o'clock, and they're going to have this whole day in front of them. And I really hope they're going to have a nice day. I really wish they're going to be happy. I really want to give them some of my heart feelings. And if I say it that way, everybody can hear it. I talked to a woman once, it was in Australia, and she was teaching communication, which is really dreadful that we need to be taught to communicate with each other. But it was very interesting, that lady. She told me that words are 7% of our communication. 93% are body language, tone of voice, facial expression, and mainly the feeling that's behind the words. We can learn it. Now, if 1 or 2 or 3 people really mean it, that they wish something really nice to happen to that person that they're talking to, eventually the person that's practicing that will mean it all the time, will mean it for everybody, and the other people can feel it. It's the same words are being used, but they can feel it. And then if they feel it, they have some happiness. And then they're going to pass it on, maybe. There's no guarantee for any of this. The only one we can educate is ourselves. And if we do have influence. There's no doubt about it. Even though there are so many human beings, each one has influence, particularly, of course, in their own surroundings. This kind of thing, that where we meet people every day, is a practice path to love them. And some of them are certainly not so lovable, are they? I mean, some are not so pleasant. Those are the ones that we can really practice on. And if we manage to love somebody who says things that we much rather wouldn't hear, we've done a big step on the spiritual path. And then comes another understanding after that, very important one, that it doesn't matter what that other person is saying or doing. That's their karma, their heart. All that matters and all that I've got to watch out for is that I'm doing the right thing and I'm feeling the right thing. Now, obviously, it's not that easy to love everybody. I saw a picture postcard, it was marvelous. There was a little mouse, I think it was, and she said, "I love everybody." And then right next to her was a huge monster, and the monster said, "I am everybody." Well, it's when our wishful thinking, you know. We can't love everybody right away. It's impossible, but we can practice. We can try. And then we can try to make it more even. If we have children, that's the easiest way to practice to make it more even. Because we know exactly what we feel for our own children. There's no doubt what we feel there. We know that. And now we can take what we feel for somebody else, anybody, the postman. And that difference we have to minimize. Make that difference smaller and smaller. Mind you, you don't do that in a day or a week or a month or even a year, but a little bit every day. Make that difference a little smaller. And life looks entirely different. And why is this such an enormous help for happiness? Because if we get that into our hearts, we will be able to rely on our own reactions. We don't have to be afraid of getting angry, worried, nervous, fearful, rejecting, nothing. We have no fear of that. We know exactly that our heart is loving, and that's the way we're going to react. And because of that, we feel secure. We look for security in all sorts of ways. The word that comes to mind is social security. Social security, insurance companies, people. But the only security they have is a loving heart. That's a totally secure way of living. So that second level of happiness, and of course, you will realize that there's more that could be said about all these four emotions, has already the kind of strengthening effect where a person can rely upon themselves and not on outside conditions. That doesn't mean that we can't make our outside conditions as favorable as we think they ought to be, but we don't have to rely upon them. And the third level of happiness comes through meditation. Those of you who maybe just started meditation will think, happiness? Well, I think it's a lot of work. Or they might think, my knees hurt. Don't think it's such a wonderful way to be happy. Or yes, that's in the beginning. we have to practice. Everything we know how to do, we have practiced. And we have practiced it unflinchingly. We had to practice to learn to walk. And if you remember, we have looked at small children, very small ones. They walk, they fall down, they get up, and they walk again. And now we walk. It's nothing. Everybody walks. We had to learn to write. And we had to practice. And able to write again and again and again. Everything we do, we had to practice. There's nothing that comes automatically. It's very interesting. So here, meditation, we have to practice. Now what we need for that practice are some wonderful qualities which are worth developing. First one is patience. Without patience, nothing will happen. Second one is endurance. And willpower. With those three, we'll make it. But if we lack one of them, we'll have stops and starts and stops and starts. And that doesn't really work. But once we have got past the method and started proper meditation, then we know why that's the third level of happiness. The methods that we use, like watching the breath or visualization or any of the methods that we use, are strictly methods. That's all they are. And we need them in order to focus the mind on something. But the meditation starts when the method stops, when we no longer need the method. We cross, so to say, a threshold into our inner being. I usually compare it to the fact that there is like a doorway, and the door is closed and locked, and most people in the world don't even know there is such a doorway. I mean, it's only symbolic anyway. But once we have stopped using our senses, which we have to do in meditation, once we have stopped reacting, all the debris that's covering that door is removed. And we can actually open it and enter into our inner being. And what we find in our inner being is exactly what we've been looking for in the world. The first thing we find is utterly delightful sensation. And in the world, we look for delight. So you can see that why I called it a stairway to heaven. We carry that delight within us all the time. It's a matter of being able to stop the sense contact, mainly of thinking, of course. Stop the thinking for a limited period of time, not permanently, naturally, for a limited period of time. And instead of thinking, experience. And the experience is of delight, which every single person carries within. And when we do experience that within, then we realize that we needn't look for it anywhere. It's right there. All we have to do is sit quiet, be still, and it's there. Once the concentration has developed to that extent. For some people, that goes fairly quickly. For some, it takes a long time. Those are karmic resultants. There's nothing to be said about it. Some need years, some need only a few months, some really take a long time. Most people don't get there, those that meditate, because they don't have the guidance to do it. Then more people in the world don't get there because they don't meditate. I mean, the meditators are still a very small minority, even though one gets to think, oh, everybody wants to meditate. I mean, frankly speaking, nobody wants to meditate. Those few that do, I mean, they're the wonderful exceptions, you know, and it's lovely to know these exceptions. And in my activity that I do, I meet only the exceptions, naturally, or those that would like to be in one of the exceptions. But even those people who are really committed to doing it, they need patience, perseverance, and willpower. Because it doesn't come by itself. But once having used those qualities and having stuck with it, there's no reason why one can't get at it. And as we do that, we realize nothing from outside is any comparison to what we carry within already. It's no comparison at all. There's so much more delight within us than any that we can get through the senses. And then, having been able to get to that first step, the first meditative absorption, there's no reason why one can't get to the others. There are 8 altogether. The Buddha was a very pragmatic, realistic teacher, and he numbered them nicely for us, 1 to 8. All the mystics of all ages, of all religions, have used them. They are the only way that a non-thinking but experiencing mind can go. There are no 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. That's the only way. However, depending on one's own background, on one's religion, on the age one lives in, then one uses different terminology to explain it. And some of the terminology is so complicated and so visual that people who read it or hear about it think that one has to be a special person to be able to do that. That's not at all like that. The Buddha said everybody can do it, and his explanation was so that we can all understand it, and also his explanation of how to get there is so simple that we can all understand it. With that simplicity of explanation, we get into a difficult area. The simplicity of explanation can very often make one think that seeing one has fully understood it, one can do it already. It happens all the time. That's, of course, one's own loss. The simplicity of explanation also brings with it that one feels it can't be that simple. There must be something more to it. And one doesn't try. Of course there's more to it. One has to do it. That's what's more. Knowing something and being able to do it is miles apart. And that's the something more. But there's another factor involved. And I'd like to mention it because it's important for those of you who do want to meditate or who are meditating. Having understood it is one thing, absolutely essential. One has to fully understand something that one wants to do or something that one wants to embark upon or is doing anyway. But one also has to love it. If one doesn't love it, then only half of oneself is engaged. We have heart and mind. In the Buddhist language, it's one word. It's called citta, C-I-T-T-A. But in our language, it's better to use two words, because we can distinguish between our emotional makeup, heart, and our logical, analytical makeup, mind. And they have to work together. If only one side of us works, then we're limping on one foot. So we have no difficulty understanding what the Buddha teaches. I don't think anybody has any difficulty with it. But then we need to have that feeling of giving oneself. Carl was calling it opening his heart, and that's essential. And then, when we have understood what we're supposed to do, and we can also give ourselves to it fully, then there's no reason why we can't do it. When we give ourselves fully to anything, but let's say in this case to meditation, then the me stands back, and what we're doing stands in front. So the meditative path stands first, and me, who's doing it, in the back of it. And that's the way it works. It's a well-known secret, and that's the only way it works. As long as I'm sitting there and I want to meditate, I want to be happy, I want to feel that delightful sensation, it doesn't work. But when I gets into the background, and the meditation is first, and the Buddha's teaching is first, and one can actually find a feeling of devotion to it, then it works. It's a long story, isn't it? Well, I'll make it short now at the end. I explained to you the very first absorption, but if we have entered into the first, there's no reason why we can't go further. They become more refined, more subtle, and the first four are the fine, they have a relationship to what we already experience in our lives. And so we can relate to them easily. But the second four have no relationship at all. They are elevated states of consciousness. And when we experience those, and I'll just say what the first two are called. One is called the infinity of space, and the next one the infinity of consciousness, just to give you an idea. And when we experience those, we come near and enter into the fourth stage of happiness. The fourth one and the final one, and the one that can no longer be interrupted. You see, loving people, that's fine. But, of course, there may be a limit to what one can do. It's still conditional. There may be conditions we can't cope with. Meditation on the jhanic absorptions, that's fine. But when we get out of them, we only carry a smattering of them with us. We can't carry the whole thing with us. So then comes the final stage of happiness, and that's called insight. That's a complete insight into absolute reality as compared to relative reality. And when we look at relative reality, that's what is in front of us all the time. Each one of us is a separate person. Each one of us lives a separate life. Each one of us has their own problems, and each one of us wants to stay alive and wants their loved ones to stay alive, and that's all relative reality. It's real, but it's relative. But when we get to the states of consciousness in the meditation, which I just named, infinity of space, infinity of consciousness, just to name two, there comes a beginning of a realization that we're not separate, that we're not just one identity, that we are a phenomena of mind, heart, and body, that we're all alike, and that there's nothing that actually puts a me in there. It's just a thought. And when we kind of finally come to that kind of realization, then the next work we have to do is try to manifest that within ourselves. And when we do, there's no longer any fear of death. Because birth and death belong together. Everything that's born has to die. Every thought that was ever born has died. Every movement that has ever originated has died. Every emotion that was born has died. Every person that was ever born will die or has already died. And if we no longer believe in the person that is called me, but just see it as a transition from being here to being there, just a transient way of being, floating like a little river with time, then fear of death disappears. And when fear of death disappears, all fears disappear. Every single fear that we have is fear of death, no matter what we call it. Fear of women, fear of men, fear of the atom bomb, fear of the next war, fear of poverty, fear of bad government, fear of criminals, fear of the dark. It doesn't matter what we call it. It's all fear of death. And what we do in our daily lives is also based upon that. Because this me that we have erroneously put inside of this mind and body wants to be supported. It wants to be acknowledged, that it's there. And because it actually isn't there, it needs constant acknowledgement. And since everybody wants this constant acknowledgement, we often run into trouble. Because the one we want to be acknowledged by is waiting for the acknowledgement from us. So there's problems. In the family, very often, the problem. Who acknowledges whom? And in the workplace, everywhere. So this support system that we're looking for is extremely important to us. To want to be appreciated. Not only that, we want to be somebody. And being appreciated and being somebody is nothing but the support system for this imaginary me that is sitting in there, looking through my eyes and hearing through my ears. And if I don't don't get this support system, I feel awful. And that's the same thing. It's the death of the ego. Death is our only fear. So the meditative absorptions don't bring us to that complete realization, but they certainly open up new windows on reality, a totally different reality, a reality which doesn't have the limitations that we set upon ourselves. We set limitations upon ourselves which are totally wrong and which make life quite difficult. We operate under stress, and we think somebody's put the stress there, the work we have to do, or the traffic, or whatever it is. That's the stress. We put the stress there ourselves. We are pushing in the wrong direction. So the last and complete source of happiness is the realization that while we're here, we are quite unique. Every person is unique, there's no doubt about it. But while we're here, there's nothing to fear. We are the same as a little stream where the water is constantly flowing. If we were to dam the stream so that the water can't flow, we get a stagnant little pond and no longer a stream. We are the same. As long as everything is flowing and changing and moving and constantly different, every thought, every breath, everything is different, ends in death. So long we are a human being. When it stops, we're a corpse. The same as this little stream. And yet, we want to make sure we can keep that what we like. We can't. It all changes all the time. And if we know that we're not totally fulfilled, if we know that there's stress, and we are looking for a way out, then we will start practicing. But as long as we believe that if we do it a little more cleverly, whatever we're doing now, but we do it a little better, and maybe in a better place, or with better people, and then it will be all right, we won't practice. There's nothing to practice. There's only changing the outer conditions. Have we changed the outer conditions several times already, we may be ready for changing the inner condition. But it is absolutely essential, if we do want to have spiritual growth, to realize that there's nothing to be changed except the inner condition. And there's one more thing that may have a bearing on this, that people nowadays often look and ask about the sense of life. What is the real meaning of a human life? And there are many answers, but in reality there's only one, and that spiritual growth within the person. Each one that does that is an enormous help to everybody else. May they never open their mouth, it's got nothing to do with it. It's a being that counts. Being what they are, that's what is meaningful. That's definitely long enough. Thank you for listening attentively.